Okay, hey everybody. Sorry. I was just waiting for a second. Okay, so I sent out the survey and it was really, really interesting. I think the conclusion that we've come to after looking at your results was a lecture that's about 30 minutes long is helpful. Anything longer than that is too much, and shorts are awesome. So I'll have to figure out what I can do about shorts. But yeah, I can definitely do a 30-minute lecture. So I'm going to put a timer on for myself so I don't get carried away. And so if you hear a beep or any kind of alarm, it's because I put a 30-minute timer on to do this lecture. So I'm going to do that really quick. And sorry, it's kind of a boring screen to look at, huh? And then we will go from there. All right. Okay, I could have had this set up, I admit. All right, so 30 minutes, here we go. Okay, so this week we're talking about chapter 5, and I'm sure you've noticed already that what I'm looking for is a division in the chapter. You're looking to read, the first half of the chapter. The reason I want to do this is because the theories in the chapter are pretty heavy hitters. And so I wanted to have a week just to focus on the theory. But to do the theory, we need to do some more definitions. And again, this is kind of a situation where you already know this stuff. You just need the terminology to make sense of it. Or not to make sense of it, but just to understand in the research what this means and what it looks like. Okay, now that I've fumbled my words, seriously fumbled my words. We're going to look at information about communicating intimacy in the family. What it is, what is intimacy, what is closeness, how does culture or biological sex or gender affect intimacy? And then what are the things that we can do to express intimacy in our families that will actually bring us closer together instead of dividing us? So hopefully you'll find this very interesting. And then next week we'll talk about all the theories that go along with this that hopefully will help you make sense of kind of some of the experiences that you may have had. At least that's what I've found by studying family communication, is that all of a sudden maybe challenges that I've faced make so much more sense. So I'm hoping for you to have an experience like that. It might not be as profound as mine was, but I hope you do find some insight in the next couple weeks, this week and next week. Okay, this week is very practical though, and that's something that I love about this class, is that we get to look at theory and also practical application. So I hope that you find that to be the case as well. So here's what we're looking at for this week, this part of chapter 5. And I think the most important part, the most important definition is everyday talk. So you'll notice that one of your assignments is to figure out a way to encourage everyday talk in your family. And if you have any questions about that assignment, please feel free to reach out. I hope that it was explained clearly enough, but sometimes we make assumptions. So, okay, everyday talk is that kind of habitual, mundane communication of various types. It could be about anything, which is vital for family intimacy and satisfaction. So interestingly enough, what might feel like the boring conversations that you have with your siblings or with your in-laws or with your parents, though those conversations are the conversations that make or break family intimacy. Right? Interesting, right? Hopefully that's interesting too. Okay, intimacy is revealed, developed, and maintained in a relationship through verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors. In other words, we cannot have closeness in our families unless we are willing to engage in all sorts of verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors. Okay, communication helps create intimacy in families. It's the mode through which intimacy is expressed, and communication is central to maintaining intimacy in family relationships. If you do not communicate with your family, you do not have a relationship with them. That's what this is saying. So I'll tell you a personal experience. Many years ago, I had a scenario where we were having a debate with my sister-in-laws. I have 6 of them, 6 sister-in-laws. Actually, I have 7 sister-in-laws. And we were kind of debating this idea of like, should there be, I don't know, information posted on Facebook about the family? Should there be a family group, and should everyone kind of be required to post what is going on? And I was arguing at the time, we're basically talking at each other. We're not really talking with each other. So while I may know what is going on in your family, it doesn't mean that I have a relationship with anyone in your family. Now, I think it would alter my argument a little bit, because kind of generally knowing what is going on, it is helpful. It's like one of those baby steps toward family closeness, but it doesn't really bring us to the place that we need to be. So notice that this needs to be a verbal and nonverbal communication behavior. And in the case of that scenario, it was, is posting information on social media enough to create a relationship? So I just kind of throw that out to you. You can think about that. I would say, again, baby step, it's some, but I'm not sure that it is actually enough. Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of this. So what is intimacy in a family? Because I think when we think of intimacy, we think of something like sexuality. But what we're talking about is just this kind of sense of connection. Okay, so intimacy and closeness usually go hand in hand in a family system. But intimacy in a partnership or in a marriage is different. And so we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit too. All right, so closeness is this kind of high level of mutual knowledge and influence. Okay, so this is where I was kind of basing my argument about the social media thing. Is like, I might know what is going on with you, but it doesn't mean I have any kind of influence. It doesn't mean that I have any type of mutual devotion or commitment or desire to interact with you. Where closeness kind of requires that, like closeness requires a sense of relationship and devotion and sharing and commitment for the long haul, with the desire to interact with each other. I think this is where chosen families shine. And remember, a chosen family is an individual who basically creates a family-like structure with people that they choose, with friends, usually with friends. It could be with siblings and friends, or whatever the case might be. But again, this is where kind of chosen family shines. Now, is it possible for a kind of traditional or nuclear family to exist in this place? 100%. It is absolutely possible. I guess I just find it very, very interesting, the contrast between the two. Okay, the other thing we need to remember about closeness is that it represents the family members' acceptance of their interdependence, like this acknowledgement, like, I am dependent on you, you are dependent on me, to have some type of needs met. And those needs might be just a sense of belonging, right? Not just. Belonging is so important. And that's enough, right? In that kind of idea of like influence and devotion and commitment and long-term approaches and long desires. Like that's enough for that to exist. So when we're talking about intimacy, we're talking about this kind of intimacy and closeness, this connection that a person might have with people in their family, nuclear or chosen. Okay, so let's interpret this a little bit more. This idea of presence also exists in intimacy and with closeness. Presence refers to this willingness to be there. The key word here is willingness. So not being forced. I can tell you all kinds of, excuse me, I'm having to shift rooms because my dogs are being incredibly loud. There is all kinds of really interesting scenarios that we get ourselves into when we talk about being willing and being coerced. And I find in this particular area of the world that sometimes we use a lot of manipulation and guilt trips to coerce presence, to coerce people to be there. But the important part of intimacy in a family and with closeness is that they're there for each other because they want to be there for each other. And they're there for each other physically, emotionally, cognitively. So, can I bounce some ideas off of you? I need to move. Are you willing to help me? This has been a really hard day and really overwhelming. So, you can kind of see we're like reaching out to each other and then having the other person be present enough to like be in the space with the person is critical for family intimacy and closeness. Family intimacy also implies that sense of commitment and devotion. Like I mentioned that on the previous slide, but I cannot underscore that enough. Okay. Again, we're looking at this idea of willingness. Like, are we willing to be there for each other? Are we committed to each other? Are we devoted to one another? And when we see that break down, that's when we start to see toxic family systems. All right. Next piece of this is culture and intimacy. I hope you find this very, very fascinating. Culture and co-culture or subcultures impact expectations for and expressions of intimacy and closeness. Okay, so I don't know if you've heard this like kind of buzzword, toxic masculinity. Okay, toxic masculinity is a really great example of this kind of co-culture or subculture that can exist that deeply impacts the expression of intimacy and closeness. Oh man, there are so many examples I'm thinking of right now. The purpose of toxic, or the whole idea of toxic masculinity or machismo or whatever, is that like a man is invincible, right? They're not vulnerable, they're not emotionally connected, they're not X, Y, or Z, right? And that's a cultural expectation. I use the word machismo because like that's a Latino example of this situation where it's like, if I am a man, then I can only be somewhat connected. Or if I am a woman, I am demanded to be connected. I'll give you an example of this. Again, you're going to be like, oh, Dr. Bridget, how are you teaching this class? Because I have so many crazy examples. Okay, so my husband and I are great examples because we are literally the whole spectrum of any scenario that can be presented in a family communication situation. So in my family of origin, my dad was very much engaged with us. Like he would talk to us. He was somewhat emotionally available. I wouldn't say he was totally emotionally available. He was somewhat. But my mom carried the burden, the emotional load of the family, right? But my dad was really right there with her. Like they did a pretty good job reflecting in an actual partnership. In my husband's family, there was a deeper division of labor. So instead of there being, the partnership looked different. So in my husband's family of origin, dad brought home the bacon, so to speak. Dad worked for the family. Mom carried all the other emotional load. Okay, so if we go back to this slide, mom was responsible to be there physically, emotionally, and cognitively for all of the children. There were 8 of them. And dad was to be there physically. And that's how they kind of divided their expression or their division of labor. And that came very much from their cultures that they came from. So you can imagine that it has been incredibly difficult for my husband and myself to merge these two types of strategies together. I'm not saying neither one is good nor bad because they both have their function, but I am saying like it's been hard to navigate because the cultural values of and expressions of those are so different that it has become inhibiting of intimacy and closeness. So I guess this is kind of an example of what that can look like and also what not to do. So we need to be mindful of the fact that like my husband and I have been married 23 years, so it's not like this is new for us, but it is really interesting. Like as we have aged in our marriage and in our partnership, we've realized like there that our cultural backgrounds, even though we're religiously the same, we come from different areas of the United States, and that cultural background has affected our marriage more than I can even express. So culture and how those expressions of intimacy and closeness show up is, I just cannot underscore it. There is a huge variability within the culture, as I just explained, and how they express intimacy and closeness. Okay, so like in my family of origin, it was all about like, let's sit down and like have a 3 hour conversation. Where for my husband's family of origin, it was more like, okay, the guys are going to go off and do this thing, and the women are going to go off and do another thing. There's just quite a, just a separation of that. And then the relationships within the family are all managed by the women in that family system. Okay, so the women take on the expression of intimacy and closeness in my husband's family system, and the men are present when called upon. Okay. All right. So that just then leads to this kind of logical conclusion that culture just like deeply affects emotional expressiveness, right? What you can say, what you cannot say, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, what emotions are okay. Remember last week there was meta emotions. Oh, actually that's this week. Okay. Meta emotions. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But that all of this kind of comes into play when we're trying to build a family that is close, that is connected, and that wants to be together. Okay. Also, another important part of this is this statement here. The way intimacy is expressed in the same culture may vary over time. And remember, families have different stages of development, just like a person does. And so how one interacts with their family and how the family interacts with each other is going to change through those stages. And that is also going to be affected by culture. Okay. So to just go back to the example of my family of origin and my husband's family of origin, in my husband's family of origin, the mom, because remember in their culture, their subculture that they've created as a family, the mom is directly responsible to disclose information about everyone to everyone. So when a person has a baby, let's say, the mom would call everyone and disclose that information. Where in my family of origin, you can see this is more individualistic. The person who had the baby or their partner or spouse was responsible to call each family member and let them know. Okay, so you can see there's a lot going on there. Their power dynamics are different. The emotional load is different. So you can kind of see like that those are reflective of our regional cultures that we come from, religious cultures that we come from, and family cultures that we come from. And I'm sure many of you have kind of bumped up against this scenario. And if you have not, you will. You will eventually. Okay, so expressing intimacy in family communication. Here's some just random information, not random, but some additional information, kind of just quick snapshots of things that I felt like were important. So biological sex and culture are two huge factors that impact emotional expressiveness. And that biological sex, emotional expressiveness is very, very fascinating, partly because we know now that we can do fMRIs that men and women's brains look like they're different species. Okay, so that particular research comes from the Amen Clinic, where they've done tens of thousands of brain scans, and they argue that men's and women's brains are like night and day different. Their brains are. And so that means that the biological sex can affect the communication expressiveness, but culture also reinforces that. Interestingly, though, there is no one size fits all theory that includes biological sex and culture because the variety is so different. Like, we cannot make generalizations about how men communicate and how women communicate. You'll notice in your text they talk about that. Like, there are people who make a lot of money off of arguing that men and women communicate differently, and they do because they're socialized to communicate differently. But if a person has come from a different social structure or from a different culture, it doesn't mean that they're going to communicate. It means they're likely to communicate very similarly, and that you'll find in your text. It was the brain scans that were most surprising about the diversion in the way the biological sex impacts how a person exists in the world. But that does not necessarily mean that it's going to affect family communication, right? Culture, and biological sex are, and how we're socialized are just too divergent. There's just too much variability, too much going on there. So if you ever see generalizations about these topics, it should be a huge red flag. Huge red flag. Okay, what that means usually is people are making they're making assumptions based off their personal experiences, which can be helpful advice, but it is not science and it is not verifiable information. So just an important kind of research, critical thinking piece that I wanted to add there. Okay, so one of the really important things that they talk about also are meta emotions. Now, I referred to this a little bit earlier in the lecture. Meta emotions refer to people having emotions about emotions. For example, anger. So I'm just going to read this quote from the book that I thought was really interesting, because this is something I've definitely bumped up against, and my guess is you probably have too. Something like this, maybe exactly, or something like it. Okay, some people are ashamed or upset about becoming angry. Others feel good about expressing anger, and still others think of anger as neither good nor bad. Okay, that's a meta emotion, an emotion about an emotion. Oh, I feel angry that I'm angry, or I feel ashamed that I'm angry, or I feel ashamed that I feel sad. Again, just to give another example from my own life, I had a scenario with one of my children. And this, again, was quite some time ago. He was about 9 years old at the time, and we were at this very large family event, and he was sitting in a booth at a restaurant, and he was like, "Mom, I'm sad." And I was like, "Well, tell me about it. Tell me what's going on." And then my sister-in-law popped over and sat next to him, and he was talking about how sad he was. And she was like, "Oh, we don't be sad. We're not sad." And I looked at her and I said, "If he's sad, he's sad. There's nothing wrong with that." So you can see how it's like what my sister-in-law were talking about were the meta emotions. She was experiencing one emotion about seeing her nephew be sad, and I was experiencing another emotion about seeing my son be sad. Okay, so I hope you find this really interesting. I would invite you to just kind of like put this on your radar over the next week and kind of see where you're bumping up against these meta emotions versus the actual emotion that you or someone in your sphere of influence might be experiencing. Okay, we have some very, very practical suggestions though, and these suggestions are behaviors that manifest closeness. You also have a conversation about this, like other assignments about this as well. These are very practical. These are ways that we can show or bring or invite closeness and intimacy in our families. Okay, these are really important. Now, these are just 7, and the researchers who developed these came up with several others, but I think these are the most kind of just reasonable, most practical things that we can do in our daily life. Okay, the first one is declarations of commitment and affection. So this is like, I love you. Um, I You're a beautiful person. I hope you have a beautiful day. Um, Anything that kind of fits along those lines. Like, sometimes I say, sometimes I say to my kids, and also like former students who have become friends, hey, I miss your face, right? That's a declaration of like, I notice you, I see you, I love you, I miss your face, okay? That's a declaration of commitment and affection. The second one is a use of positive absolute statements. So there's a lot of research and conversation around like shame and this idea of like, you're the worst or you are so bad, like, and how damaging those statements actually are. So damaging. But what is being argued here is that positive absolute statements like that can be some of the most effective ways to create closeness and to acknowledge and see someone. If you're familiar with the 5 love languages, this is what we'd call like words of affirmation. You're the best. Like my husband's sisters always tell him, you're such a rock star. Um, Stuff like that. Like things that are just like, I could not imagine having a better husband, or I could not imagine having a better wife. You're number one for me. This kind of idea of like, I put you on a little bit of a pedestal and you mean tons to me. Those kinds of statements are so important. I just cannot underscore them. So something I used to say to my kids when they were small is like, you are the best oldest child that I have. The best. Like you are the best middle child that I have. You're the best youngest child that I have. In an attempt to try to like encourage that closeness and let them know how important they are to me. Another part is using personal idioms or private jokes. Another way to say this is like an inside joke, right? Um, I'm sure you have examples of this in your own family and in your own relationships. An example for you is like in our family system. Oh, I have 3 minutes. It was always about like Walter Mitty moments. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. In that movie, he often fantasizes about alternative scenarios, and they're really, really fun kind of little scenes that happen in the movie where you can see Walter Mitty's imagination kind of going overboard. So we kind of picked up on that in our family, and it's become this inside joke of like, oh my gosh, when you said that, my Walter Mitty moment was, and then fill in the blank. That's an example of personal idioms or private language. Of course, giving comfort, validating feelings and support, super important. Touch, that connection through touch, really, really important. And in a partnership, sexuality. Now, I want to make this really important. This is sexuality related to from among peers. So, and spouses, partnerships, people outside of the family. I am not talking about sexuality within the family system, especially a closed system. Ugh, okay? But what we're talking about is sexuality in the marriage, critical. Okay? Making sure you hold your kids when they're small, holding their hands when they get older, going out of your way to hug them or love them, hold their hand, give them an arm squeeze, whatever you're comfortable with in your family that says, I'm there for you, I'm connected to you. And then in addition to that, self-disclosure. This is how I'm feeling. This is what's going on with me. Validating, giving that support and comfort and, restating kind of what's going on. Now, you'll notice that I skip playfulness. Your discussion this week is about playfulness, and so I'm going to let you kind of have that discussion there. Playfulness to me is kind of the canary in the mine. How playful can you be in a family? And part of the reason for that is because being able to be playful is a reflection of feeling safe, among other things. So you're going to have an opportunity to really break that one down. All right, my friends, I believe that is my 30 minutes, 29 minutes and 25 seconds. So I just want to let you know that I'm thinking of you. I hope you have a good week. And of course, I want to answer any questions that you might have. This stuff is so important. And I think of all the classes that I teach, most of us have families, chosen or biological, and or adoptive. And the truth is that can make or break us in in our lives. And so that's why I feel like this class is so important. Hope you have a great week. And yeah, let me know if you have anything, need anything.